The violent revolution becomes of primary value to the communists to the extent to which it can be used to condition the masses psychologically to accept the non-violent revolution, which is offered supposedly as the only alternative. Hoping to avoid further violence and bloodshed, the public is to be pressured into accepting measures that will move the country gradually and legally toward communism, but without calling it that. The strategy of the proletarian revolution calls for the quiet conversion of our government into a communist regime, but under the banner of socialism.
You have said you are a democratic socialist. Can you be a democratic socialist and a capitalist?
Well, I think it depends on your interpretation. So there are some democratic socialists that would say absolutely not. There are other people that are democratic socialists that would say, I think it's possible.
What are you?
I think it's possible. I think.
Do you say to yourself, I'm a capitalist, but?
I don't say that.
Okay.
You know, if anything, I would say I believe in a democratic economy, but.
Gotcha.
But the but is there.
Okay.
So.
According to the dictionary, socialism is a political concept based upon the principle of government ownership and control of property, the means of production, and the avenues of commerce. But the important thing, as far as this presentation is concerned, is how do the communists define it? And this is where many people are surprised to learn that the communists have an entirely different meaning for the word socialism than the average American has. Did you know that there isn't a single communist country in existence anywhere on Earth? Russia isn't a communist country. Red China isn't. Cuba certainly isn't. These are socialist lands. That's how communist leaders always describe them. You see, according to the teachings of Karl Marx, communism will come to this world only in some future utopian era when men will have learned to live together in perfect harmony. But they promote socialism just the same because they know that socialism, by definition, means control over people. If the government owns and controls all property, all means of production, and all avenues of commerce, then it controls all people. If we're dependent upon the government for our food, our clothing, our shelter, our jobs, our medical care, then we're far more effectively controlled by those who hold political power than if they stood over us with soldiers and weapons.
So, in a continuation of my last video, which you can click the link on the screen to watch if you feel so inclined, I showed how the United States has a long history of communist infiltration in our most powerful institutions. Since I showed you that communist subversion has existed for decades, I will now show you how communist strategies and rhetoric have been the same with only slight modifications since as early as 1928. Traditionally, the communist revolutions we've seen have been much more straightforward since most of the populations were poor. However, American communism is the experiment of revolution through identity in addition to class warfare. Even back in the 1960s, communists were recruiting Black Americans and also began targeting Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and American Indians. To help me, I'll be using a video from 1969 in which the lecturer, G. Edward Griffin, reads from various communist directives, stating in their own words what their intentions and strategies were and still are.
But, and this is extremely important, the communists made it clear from the very beginning that they could never hope to capture all of the United States with a war of national liberation, only part of it. You see, elsewhere in the world, the segment of the population supposedly liberated by the communists has been a majority segment. The peasants in China, the Muslims in Algeria, all the people in Cuba. But in the United States, our Negro population is in the minority. And even if the communists should be successful in creating similar liberation movements among other segments of our people, as they're trying to do, for instance, among Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and even American Indians, even if they should succeed and then amalgamate all of these together into one large liberation movement, it still adds up to a minority of the total population.
The introduction of the oppressor versus oppressed identity of the Black American goes as far back as 1928, coming directly from Stalin's Soviet Union. Communists keenly identified the second-class status of black Americans as the most important tool in destabilizing our national identity. So let's discuss what the communists call the Negro Question.
Now, this communist booklet, entitled American Negro Problems, was published in 1928. It'll be necessary for us to examine rather closely the communist position on what they describe as the Negro Question. As early as 1928, the communists declared that the racial differences among our people constituted the weakest and most vulnerable point in our social fabric. By constantly probing and straining at this one spot, they calculated that eventually the cloth could be torn apart and that Americans could be divided, weakened, and perhaps even set against each other in open combat. They said in no unmistakable terms that the Negro people, because of their secondary social status and their predominant working class composition, offered greater revolutionary possibilities than any other cross-section of the population. The people of this nation were said to be oppressed and exploited by colonialist, imperialist, racist America. Consequently, the Communist Party called for their liberation.
Instead of using their age-old tactic of pitting the poor against the rich in a violent revolution in other countries, in American communism, they pitted black Americans against white Americans.
Divide the people. Split them into quarreling factions, fighting among themselves rather than their common enemy. This is the comrades' first rule for the conquest of any country. For well do they know from long experience that the nation so divided and weakened can be easily conquered from within.
With the sole intention of the white Americans becoming violent in retaliation. However, we must not give in to their agitation. Being an anti-communist means living your life in sole opposition to communist goals. Oddly enough, we incorrectly project black communist behaviors onto black Americans in general. If I may, perhaps we can call them Uncle Coms. Coms, of course, being short for communists. So we can identify those who are serving communism in an effort to distinguish them from our patriotic black Americans.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, no evaluation would be complete if we failed to note that the communist blueprint calls also for white retaliation and violence in the black communities. It's a very important objective for the Communist Party. So far, they've only been able to involve a small percentage of our Negro people in this war of national liberation. The great majority want no part of it in any form. But the one sure way to change that is to have white vigilante groups striking into the Negro sections supposedly to seek revenge. We mustn't kid ourselves into thinking that the communists have placed their agitators only into the black communities. They're working both sides of the street. They want hatred, violence, and bloodshed between the races, and they don't care how they get it or whom they use, even children if necessary. Part of the plan calls for commando squads of black revolutionaries to drive into the white residential areas and shoot little children playing on the sidewalks for the sole purpose of drawing out of the white communities violent retaliation into the black communities. Now, this is extremely important to the communists. They must have it. For in this way, they plan to unite the entire Negro population for protection behind the militant minority. It's not a very pretty picture, but it's one we need to understand so that no matter what happens to us or to our families, God willing, we'll have the strength at least to avoid doing anything that would play further into the hands of the communists.
We need to understand communist subversion and how to identify their tactics to keep our nation safe. I agree. They're working both sides of the street. I also agree. But how have the communists been playing both sides for so long?
The next question of importance is, how do the communists promote socialism? Certainly it takes far more than a mere declaration of intent, more than writing a few books. How can they bring it off, especially when there are so few of them? How can they manipulate the vast majority into accepting socialism when they really don't want it? Well, here again we find that they have a plan. The strategy is precise and well tested. Now, the general strategy employed is a political pincers movement, and these are the terms the communists use to describe it. a pincers movement applying political pressure from above and from below. Now, when they talk about pressure from above, they mean using their people and their influence within the very government marked for takeover to bring forward official recommendations for legislation. These come from the highest possible levels.
Please allow me to deviate for a moment and show you how a popular mainstream actress has been allowed to publicly advocate for communism since the 70s. Since she only ran for a government office, but had the popularity of a famous actress, I want you to see, in their own words, how the American communist is allowed to publicly subvert larger society with their cultural influence. In 1979, Jane Fonda said this.
Miss Fonda was nominated to the Arts Council and the Senate rejected the nomination. Miss Fonda, you said that that was McCarthyism. Aren't you, however, trying to have it both ways? You use your art itself and the fame and money you get from art to advance political purposes, but then when you're considered for a public office affecting the arts, you say that it's wrong to consider your politics.
Oh, considering my politics on the issues would be fine. I always welcome a good political fight. But I was slandered on the floor of the Senate. My patriotism was questioned on the floor of the Senate without my being given a right to answer those charges. They are very serious, slanderous charges, and I think that that smacks of McCarthyism. I have experienced McCarthyism in the past. For 5 years during the Nixon administration, it was very difficult for me to get work because of my political beliefs.
Oh, McCarthyism. It can only be McCarthyism if she was accused of being a communist. Well, in 1970, Jane Fonda said this.
You have a 2-year-old daughter, Vanessa.
Yes.
In what kind of a society do you think that she'd be living in, let's say about 18 or 15 years from now?
Well, I would hope that she would be living in an unpolluted, Marxist, socialist country.
See? She never said she was a communist. It's such a shame. Another innocent victim of McCarthyism. Click the link on screen from the previous video if you haven't already. She's just a mother that wants her 2-year-old daughter to grow up in a Marxist socialist country. You have no proof that she's a communist. Shame on you for thinking that. I mean, just look at her quote on IMDb. Jane Fonda, and I quote, "I, a socialist, think we should strive toward a socialist society all the way to communism. People think actresses find public speaking easy, and it's not easy at all. We're used to hiding behind masks." Oh, okay. You're just gonna hold that one lone quote against her like some sort of obsessive, fascist, Nazi, anti-Semitic.
When obstructionists become too irritating, label them as fascist or Nazi or anti-Semitic.
Right-wing extremist.
Now, of course, the minute you begin to think along these lines, you'll become the target of a whole barrage of attacks. You'll be called a witch hunter, a McCarthyite, a right-wing extremist, and other delicate phrases that are well designed to intimidate the average person into silence. If that doesn't work, then you'll be called a fascist, or at least a dictator, because supposedly you want to deny basic constitutional freedoms to a small group of Americans just because they happen to hold political views that are different from yours. How many times have you heard that?
As a man from the future, making a video about a man in the past, about this very topic, I can tell you with a high degree of confidence, ooh, we've heard it a lot. But just because Jane Fonda defended a communist utopia back then, doesn't mean she feels like that now. Let's check in on how she feels when she was a guest on The View, a mainstream platform, about murdering her political opposition 50 years later in 2023.
Activist Jane Fonda appeared on The View this past Friday talking about abortion rights. When asked what else she would do to take a stand aside from marching and protesting, Fonda replied with murder. Let's take a look.
We're not going back. I don't care what the laws are. We're not going back.
We're not going back. I think the women will rise up.
That's the activist.
That's Jane
Speaking, and she probably will get a Nobel Prize.
But it's the truth.
Very soon.
It is the truth.
But we're not going to do it.
Besides marching and protesting, what else do you suggest? Well, it doesn't happen overnight. It's not a miraculous. What did you say? Murder. She's kidding. Wait a second. She's just kidding.
Don't say that. That's
you don't know. They'll pick up on that and just run with it.
The worst.
She's just kidding. It's.
Well, let me talk to you about.
Well, here we are picking up on it, I guess.
Isn't she a gem, folks?
With phase one, that of dividing the population, completed, the revolutionists were ready to move into phase two of the communist blueprint for takeover. Create the appearance of popular support. In every country now part of the Red Slave Empire, the actual number of Communist Party members at the time of takeover has been less than 1% of the total population. As Lenin phrased it,
communism must be built with non-communist hands.
Let me give you a quick timeline of events. In 1969, a man warning about American communism, reading from their directives, said this:
The non-violent phase of revolution actually is more important to the communists and more potentially dangerous to us. Now, the strategy for this phase calls for the gradual transition of our government into a communist regime, done peacefully and legally, but under the banner of socialism.
Then a year later, in 1970, a famous actress said this about her 2-year-old daughter and the world she wants her to grow up in.
Well, I would hope that she would be living in an unpolluted, Marxist, socialist country.
Then 9 years later, in 1979, Jane Fonda cries McCarthyism. Because she's not a communist, she's a socialist. She's being victimized by the system for her political beliefs, for her benign political beliefs.
And I think that that smacks of McCarthyism.
You might think to yourself, surely the American public felt comfortable proudly advocating against communism in the 1960s, right?
after the communists have found some issue or point of difference upon which they can divide the people, get them fighting among themselves rather than their common enemy, the next step is to create the appearance of popular support for the communists' war of national liberation. They have been devastatingly successful thus far. Yet in one country after another, there have been alert, informed individuals who saw the signs, recognized the patterns of conquest, and raised their voices to warn the people. Against just such a contingency, the communists developed the third phase of their blueprint for world domination: neutralize the opposition.
We can and must write in a language which sows among the masses hate, revulsion, and scorn toward those who disagree with us.
A Communist Party directive issued in 1943 reads,
Members and front organizations must continually embarrass, discredit, and degrade our critics. When obstructionists become too irritating, label them as fascist or Nazi or anti-Semitic. Constantly associate those who oppose us with those names which already have a bad smell. The association will, after enough repetition, become fact in the public mind.
Well, apparently people that escaped communism and saw how Americans were putting up with widespread communist rhetoric and ideas had a different experience.
Some years ago, I happened to attend a meeting where several anti-communist refugees from behind the Iron Curtain were called upon to relate their personal experiences. Some of the questions that came from the audience were rather naive, I suppose, because finally one of the refugees spoke up and he said, "You know, you Americans have funny ideas about life under communism. Apparently you think there's a communist soldier standing on every street corner with a rifle and bayonet to keep the people in line. But this isn't so." He said, "Oh, sure, in the beginning there were plenty of soldiers and executions and deportations to slave labor camps, but we don't see much of that anymore. The open violence lasted only for about a year or a year and a half, and then the anti-communist leadership was liquidated. And now, to the casual observers, there's a great deal of apparent calm and freedom." For instance, he said, "I lived in the largest city in the country. We had a large park there directly across the street from a beautiful church." He said they left one church open, one in the entire country, primarily for guided tours of visiting Americans who had come to see if religion was being persecuted. He said, "Anytime I wanted to, I could have gone into that park, stood on a bench, and spoken out against communism. Then I could have walked across the street into that church and knelt down in prayer, and I wouldn't have been arrested or bothered in any way. But you can be sure I did not do these things, because if I had, the very next day, the wheels of the bureaucracy would have begun to turn.
Sounds like an extreme form of what we call nowadays cancel culture. Sure, you're allowed to espouse your views, but there's been an accelerated tactic the internet brought to communists to allow mass hate campaigns against political dissidents. Just the accusation alone is enough to make a citizen second-guess their seemingly innocuous opinions.
And I would have been informed that my quota of food stamps had been cut, that my allotment for clothing and shoes had been reduced, that my allocation for living quarters had been downgraded, and finally, that my job assignment had been changed from the kind of work for which I'd been trained to menial labor at lower pay. So none of us did any of those things that we were theoretically entitled to do because of the tremendous power that the Communist Party had over our economic existence.
Under violent communism, this is how it manifested. However, under non-violent communism, it's much more subversive and psychological. The more control they have over your economic activity, the more control they have over you as a person. And what did they do with that control over you?
And then he said something that I'll never forget. He hesitated for a moment, and weighing his words very carefully so as not to hurt our feelings, he said, "You know, I came to America expecting to find a nation of free men. But instead, I find exactly the same thing. Everywhere I look, I see men and women who know that communists are making headway in this country. They know that something must be done and that someone must stand up to them. But they themselves do nothing. They remain silent because they're afraid that if they speak out or take a stand publicly, it'll be bad for business. They may lose a client. They may even lose their jobs. Or perhaps they're receiving a regular government check and already are too dependent upon some of the very people and programs they know they should oppose."
As above, so below. Above we have the media admonishing your business for accusations of racism, fascism, transphobia, Islamophobia, or
imperialism, or colonialism, or whatever.
And below we have government assistance from Democrats influencing their constituents, a significant population of Black Americans, through economic pressure and reliance on a subversive political party, claiming to be advocating for them, gaining compliance. Sure, they make their cities destitute and crime-ridden, but that's because of capitalism. It's the racist, colonial, Nazi, McCarthyite fascists that want to harm them. Try to disagree with them and remember how they treated you for doing so.
And then he said, "These men voluntarily have gone behind the Iron Curtain. They're already taken over by the communists. The only difference is that for the present at least, they can still get out any time they really want to, and we could not." I think there's a great lesson to be learned from that because it's true, isn't it? There are many men who are physically brave beyond any question when it comes to standing up against a tyranny that threatens with armies. Some of them carry the actual scars of battle to prove it. But when it comes to this new kind of war, they're lost to the fight. When there is no battlefield, when the weapons are not rifles or bombs but economic pressures, then who is your enemy? How do you fight? Where do you begin? It's precisely for these reasons that any modern dictatorship must have control over the economic sphere of all human activity. This was true of Nazism, it was true of fascism, it's true of communism, and it's also true of socialism. Regardless of what name we give it, total government control is by definition totalitarianism. That's what the word means.
Black Americans have been targeted with this strategy for almost a century. Communists have specific racial slurs for Black Americans that try to be independent. It evolved from fascist, Nazi, and racist to Uncle Tom, House Nigga, and Coon. The communist directive is complete government control over Black Americans to make them dependent on the Democrats that are actually oppressing them and instill a sense of identity through communist antagonization against their fellow Americans. The black struggle is not against white people. It's against capitalism. The black communist will choose the white communist over the black conservative or Republican. The Democrats use black Americans as cannon fodder.
I am Leonard Patterson. When I was a young man, only 23 years old, I joined the Communist Party. I joined the party because I honestly thought the communists were trying to help American Negroes. I broke away from the party when it became clear to me what the communists were really up to was to use the Negro people in this country as cannon fodder in a violent and bloody revolution aimed at the establishment of the American Soviet dictatorship.
I'm Julia Brown. For 9 years, I was a member of the Communist Party, serving as an undercover agent for the FBI. During that time, I learned that the communist conspiracy had been planning and working for years to bring violent revolution to America. It was to be a communist revolution, but the great majority of the American people would not be allowed to realize that until it had already happened. If all goes according to the communist blueprint, Americans will believe that the chaos and violence has something to do with civil rights. Our enemies were quick to find our weakest point for their attack. They knew that racial differences could provide them with an excellent wedge to divide our people. Their strategy simply has been to keep hammering on that wedge, to drive it deeper into our social structure, to open all wounds that have long since healed, and deliberately to create new ones wherever they can.
Now he acted like a good nigga for the white folks. But I tell you, I don't want to even be around no more good niggas. I'm with them good Negroes. That's what they call Rodriguez, a good Negro. I want to be with the bad niggas, because I know what's happening with the bad niggas. That's
the racial tension you've grown up seeing in our nation, believed to be an organic and allegedly cause and effect response to discrimination and slavery, has actually been an intentional communist directive to destabilize and divide us since 1928. Look at how it's evolved. Men versus women, gay versus straight, queer versus heteronormative, people of color versus white people. Do you know what the definition of people of color is? It just means not white people. It's a term specifically devised to separate all of humanity into white versus not white. They will always make everything into two groups, and that is conflict theory. And in the same way the communist claims to advocate for black people, the black Americans that seek to unify under an American identity are said to have internalized oppression. If they disagree, they must be self-hating black people. The same humanity that they prey upon for claims of social justice will immediately be preyed upon in times of dissent. The same tactic of guilt and shame they use to justify violence in the streets will be pinpointed on anyone, regardless of identity or class. Even if you agree with the communists 99%, you will be treated as a pariah if you deviate from the communist directive.
The next step in the communist strategy is the most easily recognized, for it consists of the tactic of getting masses into motion, and thus precipitating mob violence. Master psychologists that they are, the communists know that once the masses are in the streets, it's not too difficult to convert an orderly demonstration into a full-scale riot. They know, too, that when rioting occurs, police and military forces of the government must move to restore law and order, and thus they have the first visible signs of revolution.
Riots, demonstrations, street battles, detachments of a revolutionary army, Such are the stages in the development of the popular uprising.
The official constitution and program of the Communist Party stated in 1921,
"The Communist Party will educate and organize the working masses for mass strikes and mass demonstrations. It is through struggles that the working masses are prepared for the final conflict for power. As these strikes grow in number and intensity, they acquire political character through unavoidable collision and open combat with the capitalistic state. Mass action culminates in insurrection and civil war."
In 1964, a communist document taken from the Viet Cong stated,
"Get the people out into the streets. Quarrels should be provoked. Youth groups are to be armed with knives and clubs, allegedly to protect themselves in the manufactured tension."
In China, as in all countries, the communist appeal was aimed primarily at students, young, idealistic intellectuals, most of whom came from wealthy families who could afford to send them to school. It was from this group that the young communist recruits came who later provided the leadership and backbone for the armed conflict to follow. In Cuba, leftist-oriented students were the vanguard of the organized street demonstrations. Once the masses were in motion, that tenuous line between demonstration and riot, between nonviolence and violence, was easily obliterated. As law enforcement officers sought to restore order, police brutality became the cry of the insurgents.
So fight with the police and then blame them for doing their job.
Algeria was more of the same. Rallies, demonstrations, marches, and the inevitable flare of violence.
I honestly don't even know where to find this footage nowadays of things that were actually happening back then. When we talk about protesting and demonstrations and how they get out of control. This is from a video from 1966.
The invariable charges of police brutality were hurled as efforts were made to maintain law and order.
Now, in passing, ladies and gentlemen, you may have wondered why the Communist Party has been a staunch supporter of the drive to place a black studies curriculum into our high schools and colleges. Well, the reason becomes obvious the minute you take a look at the textbooks and the study guides. The net effect of these courses on the students who enroll is to create a consciousness of nation. By stressing the historical and cultural differences between our black and white citizens instead of the similarities, the predictable impact upon the student is such that he'll view the communist call for a separate nation with far more acceptance than his parents did. Under the guise of academic balance, these courses have become a brilliant device for conditioning young people to accept still one more part of the total program for revolution. Following the communist line in every detail, these men claim that they're the representatives of a new government and a new nation within the continental borders of the United States. They issued a demand to the State Department that a large segment of land be turned over to them as their rightful territory. The proclamation said that they're now prepared to negotiate in good faith the peaceful transfer to them of the southern portion of the United States. The implication being, of course, that if they don't get it peacefully, then they'll just have to take it by force and violence. Already, the Republic of New Africa has established a central headquarters in Mississippi, and its leaders in the north are actively recruiting a Black Panther guerrilla force and what they call a Revolutionary Freedom Corps, the RFC, from among black militant students to act as organizers and to set up local provisional governments, as they call them, in the so-called ghetto areas.
Under the guise of a humanitarian effort, the Black Studies courses were riddled with communist propaganda and division. Black history has always been, and always will be, a communist directive to separate black Americans from the United States. But American communism is an experiment in non-violent revolution. 3 years before the release of this film, in Red China, Mao Zedong's Red Guard was formed. The Red Guard consisted of over 10 million students that acted as the paramilitary force for their communist leader. If you look up the Red Guard on Wikipedia, you'll notice some rather subversive characterizations of their affiliations. The Red Guards were a mass, student-led paramilitary social movement mobilized by Chairman Mao Zedong in 1966 until their abolishment in 1968. seemed pretty effective. Only 2 years. During the first phase of the Cultural Revolution, which he had instituted. So it was a student-led social movement. Sound like anything you've heard of in the past few years? In the past decade? There's no leader. It's just a student-led paramilitary social movement, which the leader had instituted, but it was student-led. Interesting. According to a Red Guard leader, the movement's aims were as follows. Chairman Mao has defined our future as an armed revolutionary youth organization. So if Chairman Mao is our Red Commander-in-Chief, and we are his Red Guards, who can stop us? First, we will make China Maoist from inside out, and then we will help the working people of other countries make the world red, and then the whole universe. Even the Nazis had earthly intentions. It sounds like we're dealing with intergalactic communist cultists here. So obviously they were communist, right? Obviously Wikipedia will clearly and obviously call them communist, right? Well, their allegiance was to Mao Zedong, who was the ceremonial figurehead. You know, Hitler wasn't the leader, he was the ceremonial figurehead. The motives of Mao's Red Guard was preserving the revolutionary ideology of Mao and his position within the Chinese Communist Party. Imagine if I characterized World War II as the motives behind the Nazis as preserving the revolutionary ideology of Hitler and his position within the Nazi Party. Kind of a milquetoast way of describing that. The ideology is Maoism. The political position is far left. Still can't call them communists. Try to find me something more communist than this, and we, in popular lexicon, still can't call it communist. Even that's far left. So when someone says that something is far left, it's the most extreme communism possible. There's no logical leaps there. Wikipedia is very popular. It's very mainstream. This is how we're categorizing history. If you have a child that goes to school and they go on Wikipedia to look up Mao's Red Guard, they're gonna see that they were just far left, not communist. For some mysterious reason, if you Google this topic, it's not really giving you an accurate representation. For some reason, a film made in 1966 called Anarchy USA gives you a more accurate representation of what was happening. It seems like Google is leaving out some pertinent details.
In China, the propaganda mills were active in championing Mao's agrarian reform. The propagandists portrayed in vivid detail the hardships and injustices of the Chinese peasant. The communists popularized the slogan, "Land to the tiller." Mao Zedong exclaimed, "We are not striving for the social and political communism of Russia. Rather, we prefer to think of what we are doing as something Lincoln fought for in the Civil War, the liberation of slaves." In the United States, those books which praised Mao Zedong as non-communist and an agrarian reformer were advocated reading, and some even became book club selections. It was later revealed that many of the pro-communist books and articles were written and reviewed in this country by communists. The American people, unaware of the treachery, were conditioned to accept the enslavement of China's millions.
So that was a film from 1966. Now I want you to listen to a man that was in middle school in 1966 in Mao Zedong's Red China that experienced his Cultural Revolution. Let's see how far left it is.
In 1966, I was in the middle school when the Cultural Revolution started. I was totally pour my energy, even my life, into it to support whatever Mao asked me to do. It was exciting. We thought he was a god. Teachers were the target of the political campaign. Mao taught us they have to receive the re-education by the worker and peasant.
The way that you coerce and demoralize the middle class into following the communist directive is the above gives a command to the below. The below are the students. So you signal to the students to teach the teacher how to act. This is when they're a majority. This is how they enact the communist directive when they are the majority. They will turn the students on the teacher and start re-educating the teacher and humiliating the teacher. Remind you, this is violent communism. This is not non-violent. This is what they want to do to you in this country, and it is happening.
My female teacher, I love. She liked to wear beauty clothes. She cared for appearance. There was a criminal accusation. One boy went to her bedroom and lead so many people. She went there to cut her hair. I went there too late. The hair has been cut already. He was humiliated, and I couldn't help. I couldn't help. I couldn't rescue her. Shame on me. Shame on me.
After reports of riotings, beatings up, and even murder, the Red Guards seem to have gone too far. Their leaders have told them to cool off and go and help with the harvest.
Okay, students, calm down. Stop killing people and start actually doing the labor that we need to make society work. That's a little too far left for me. If I was a little braver, I'd call it communism. So that's the violent form of communist infiltration utilizing brainwashing students to support the state. I know communism is a stateless society. I know, I get it. But I might explode if I can't call it communism. So how does that look with non-violent communism? With American communism that's non-violent, a lot more subversive. It takes a longer time. I mean, there was a deviation in ideology between the Marxist-Leninist communists in Russia and what became Maoism. Violent revolutionary communism is what's known as Maoism. Marxist-Leninist communism from Russia is what's non-violent communism. Allegedly, they debated about it.
I'd like to point out that this concept of two kinds of revolution is really the basis for that much publicized split between Moscow and Peking. The Moscow group says there are two kinds of revolution, violent and nonviolent. We believe in using either or both, depending on which combination proves to be the most effective. But as true Marxist-Leninists, we believe that the gradual, nonviolent approach is more effective in today's modern world. To which the Peking group shouts in reply, heresy, heresy. True, there are two kinds of revolution, and we are to practice either or both, but we are the true Marxist-Leninists, for we believe that the quick, violent approach is more effective in today's modern world. And there's the total difference between the two factions of world communism. Each claims to be more correct in its interpretation of classical communist strategy. But as far as the United States is concerned, you can be sure that it makes precious little difference. Both types of revolution are being used against us today. Both are enhanced by the presence of the other, and both lead to exactly the same destination.
So the Black Studies curriculum is non-violent Maoism. Maoism trained the students to take over the school, to take over the teacher by force, with numbers. This literally grooms students into a revolutionary ideology, where they can see in person how much power they have in numbers and how much control they can have over their own teacher, who is an authority figure. It's training them to overthrow small sources of power and show them how much power they have when they follow their leader.
Fuck you and fuck the police!
Last month, Evergreen State College in Washington went crazy when a professor of evolutionary biology named Brett Weinstein objected to a day of absence when white students and faculty were asked to voluntarily leave campus. Weinstein branded it a form of racial segregation. A group of student protesters called him a racist. The confrontation incited further protests, debates over free speech, and claims of systemic racism on campus. And things haven't calmed down. Tomorrow, Evergreen will hold its graduation at an off-campus location, 40 miles away.
Would you like to hear the answer or not?
No!
Okay.
This is the video, viewed by millions, that put Evergreen State and Weinstein in the national spotlight.
This is not a discussion. You have lost that one.
This is not a discussion. You've lost that one.
Yeah, you've lost that one.
So what are they doing here if they don't want to talk to you?
Well, this is part and parcel of their central mode. They're just simply shutting down somebody that they don't want to hear from.
I am not interested in debate. I am interested only in dialectic, which does mean I listen to you and you listen to me.
How the email
Weinstein has taught at Evergreen State for 14 years. He describes himself as deeply progressive, but has been denounced as a racist tool of the alt-right by some students and faculty.
Instead of cutting off a teacher's hair, as we saw with Brett Weinstein at Evergreen College, you can just corner the teacher and shout at them and berate them and not listen to them and not have a civil conversation and just purely antagonize the teacher into being complicit. We have been slowly, generationally, culturally groomed into passively feeling like something is obviously wrong, yet fearing economic and severe social retaliation if we speak up about it, no matter how considerate our candor is. The evolution of American communism has manifested through protected classes. A protected class is afforded extra protection. If you commit a crime against a member of a protected class, and through their protected status, includes insulting speech against their protected class, you will have a harsher penalty imposed upon you. They weaponize their protected status, granted to them by the above, to draw your attention to their identity, blinded by your own good faith and charitability, so you ignore the slow advancement of their communist agenda through constantly fighting with police. Ask yourself this question honestly. Does it seem like there's a harsh penalty for fighting with the police? Do they really seem that scared of the police? Imagine if you're a nefarious illegal in our nation, and you see how easy it is to get away with crime, and you just use the protection from your politically approved identity to join the revolution. What a coincidence that Democrats flooded the country with a bunch of desperate displaced people ready for revolution.
When marches and demonstrations turn into riots in any country slated for takeover, the communists are then ready to implement the final stage of their blueprint for conquest. It takes only a handful of armed opportunists, criminals and savages to create the semblance of revolution.
Only insurrection can guarantee the victory of the revolution. The purpose of insurrection must be not only the complete destruction or removal of all local authorities and the replacement by new, but also the expulsion of the landlords and the seizure of their land.
The recommendations, of course, are offered supposedly as solutions to national problems. But when passed into law, their only real effect is to vastly increase the power of government and to move the country that much closer toward the ultimate goal. The pressure from below, then, involves using their influence over the various mass membership organizations of the country to create the appearance of great popular support for these recommendations. Of course, the members of those organizations must never suspect that they're being used to promote the communist program. Now, the silent majority
is stronger than ever before.
The average person with no particular axe to grind is caught right in the middle. He looks above and sees highly respected spokesmen for government calling for socialist legislation. He looks below and sees mobs of demonstrators shouting for the same thing. He says to himself, has everyone gone crazy or is it me?
That's the walk away moment for a lot of people. Am I going crazy? Is it just me? I'm seeing this above and I'm seeing this below and I'm caught in the middle and I feel like a lot more people should be speaking out against this. There's a lot of things that are obviously wrong, but I feel uncomfortable saying it. I feel like I've been pressured into not criticizing what's happening.
Now, he's still in the majority, of course, but he doesn't know it. He thinks he's helplessly outnumbered, and he bows to what he thinks is the democratic will of the majority. All that remains, then, is for the duly elected legislators to place their own careers and political expediency above the best interests of the nation, to yield to this political pressure and pass the legislation into law. Then the whole process starts all over again with new recommendations from above, new demands from below, and finally, new capitulation in the halls of Congress. In this way, the nation can move to the left in giant strides until the ultimate goal of communism itself is reached entirely legally through the constitutional process and in the name of the nation.
Have you noticed that progressives seem to keep progressing towards something they can't define? At what point do they have enough progress? It's infinite progress. Progress toward what? They keep preaching democracy, yet justify and tacitly endorse the violence in the streets. During the quarantine race war in 2020, people on the right were issued citations for cutting hair in public.
For today's event, our main goal again is to educate, time frame, verbal warning, time frame, and if we need to be, we'll issue a citation, which we have done today.
While the attack on property and political dissenters were promoted by mass media, some of us following closely remember all the on-the-ground streams showing what was really happening. It felt bizarre, uncomfortable, and suspect that mass media was justifying and rarely demonizing the nationwide burning of our government property, and worse, the businesses of our own citizens during a pandemic lockdown when our citizens were not only restricted from going to work and school, but demonized for advocating to do so. But how did it happen so quickly and seamlessly? What protests do you remember more from the pandemic lockdown in 2020? People protesting to be allowed to go back to school and work? Or the global protests for racial justice for George Floyd that spanned to 60 countries? Why would the world be so concerned with the death of George Floyd during a global pandemic? Especially since not only was the police officer that knelt down on George Floyd's neck put in prison, but the trial did not even bring up race as a factor. What was the proof for a racial motive? They don't need proof of a racial motive if they manufacture a crisis through intense political polarization to
divide the people,
utilize the weakest points in a society's social fabric to prey on the average citizen's emotions by claiming the cause is for a humanitarian effort to
create the appearance of popular support,
shut down all people with opposing opinions by labeling them fascists, Nazis, Zionists, and transphobes to
neutralize the opposition,
and with the illusion of popular support, take to the streets to force police intervention to challenge the state to justify
precipitating mob violence.
And finally, through the culmination of the first 4 steps, and with their newfound sense of support and camaraderie, they
create the semblance of revolution.
Think of what we could have accomplished back then if we had some sort of group that was investigating these national acts of violent civil disobedience. It must have seemed strange and coordinated. We have the internet nowadays. We can see videos of what's happening. How do you think the government would have investigated these massive, highly coordinated protests in 1968?
Now, this is perhaps the most classic recent example. It's the report of the President's National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, better known as the Kerner Report, released to the public in March of 1968.
So since the violent protests of the civil rights movement a few years prior, a government report was sent out to be like, listen everybody, we're investigating all of these seemingly random, insanely violent riots across the country, and we want to dispel some rumors about how they were organized. Also, you wouldn't have this much violence if you just gave us a little more power over your lives.
Have you read this? It's incredible. The list of recommendations, supposedly to remove the causes of civil disorders in America, reads almost identical to the new program of the Communist Party. And that's not much of an exaggeration either. It calls for the vast expansion of all welfare programs and agencies. It suggests absorbing all city, county, and state welfare programs into one gigantic federal welfare program. And why have state socialism when you can have national socialism? It calls for a government-guaranteed minimum wage. It calls for federal financing and control of every conceivable sphere of human activity. Education, housing, transportation, even insurance policy.
That's about Democrat.
It calls for strict gun control laws and even recommends the creation of a national police force. But the most incredible thing about this report, I think, is not the list of recommendations. That's almost expected from groups of this kind nowadays. The real shocker lies in its findings, the discoveries it made. Here was a body of men, highly respected, with the prestige and financial resources of the federal government at their disposal. Their task was to uncover all of the causes of civil disorders in our land, and to do so impartially with favor or malice to no one, let the chips fall where they may. Now, would you suppose that the Communist Party played some tiny, microscopic role in the riots, the campus disorders, the assaults against police? Well, you're mistaken. Just because the leaders of these revolutionary movements carry the Viet Cong flag, pay homage to Che Guevara, travel frequently to Moscow and Peking, preach against capitalism, promote the building of socialism, follow the communist line without deviation, and move in perfect unison in every major city, that doesn't prove anything. According to the Kerner report, the communists are playing absolutely no role at all in civil disorders. Look it up in the index.
Yeah, these people aren't communists. They just want to improve the country, right? It's not as if decades later they're just consistently encroaching and gaining more and more power. It's never enough, seemingly.
Here's a book with over 600 pages of fine print dealing with all of the causes of civil turmoil. And the words communism or communist aren't found even once. Not even to say that they looked into it and found it not to be an important factor, which is the expected cliche today. Apparently, the internal threat of communism is no longer even worth looking into.
So despite all of the obvious signs of communist influence, during a time where ordinary citizens felt a threat of social governance against vocalizing their concerns of communist infiltration, predictably, the federal government, in an effort to grow larger in size, found no connection to any communist organizations having any effect on the nationwide violent protests.
But what about the other half of the pincers? Is there any evidence of pressure from below? Well, consider the nature of such things as the mass action tactics of the Selma March of 1965, the various peace marches and civil rights marches held in almost every major city in the intervening years, the Poor People's Campaign and Resurrection City. What are these? Do they truly represent an expression of the majority of Americans, or are they merely well-organized pressure groups putting on an impressive show to create the illusion of vast popular support? And what effect does this have on Congress? Every time there's a new show of strength, doesn't Congress buckle under the political pressure and pass into law the recommendations previously made by some commission or agency of the federal government? And hasn't the silent majority been caught between these pincers? And hasn't the country been taking giant strides to the left through our constitutional process and in the name of the nation?
If he only knew. When you think about giant strides to the left, do you happen to think of transitioning our kids to the opposite sex? The man's a prophet. You know, I really wish they taught this at schools that are controlled by people indoctrinating our kids. I wonder why they don't teach them about this strategy that seems to be proven very true right now, to the point where a layman such as myself is showing you.
You know, it always bothers me when I have to agree with the communists. It doesn't happen very often, but every once in a while, I'll read something in the communist press that is 100% correct. It comes out in their favor even without their having to lie about it. And here's an example. In the People's World, the January 29, 1966 issue, the communists said, "The problem is that the power structure that runs both of the old political parties seems to have great difficulty in comprehending what is taking place in the Negro freedom movement. They don't know a revolution when they see one." And all I can say to that is amen. They sure don't. They call it everything under the sun except a revolution. And they're the same people, by and large, who still tell you it can't happen here. Ladies and gentlemen, not only can it happen here, not only is it happening here, but it has been happening here for years. The problem is that most of us haven't been able to recognize a revolution in all of its forms when we saw one.
When he said, back then the problem is, most of us haven't been able to recognize a revolution in all of its forms when we saw one. Well, it has evolved into, the problem is, most of us haven't been socially allowed to vocalize that there's a revolution in all of its forms when we see one. Think of what happens when you say a trans woman isn't a woman at your place of work, or on the street possibly being the star in a viral video. There's protected classes now. Communists don't believe in capitalism. Your reputation is currency. The above gives the protected classes an elevated reputation. Don't the most marginalized people in society seem to have the most social capital? Do you perhaps feel as though illegal immigrants may be getting preferential treatment even over legal immigrants? How comfortable do you feel about discussing illegal immigration in the public square or at work? We can't talk about communism, because that's like a wolf letting the sheep talk about the wolf.
Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to close this presentation with two observations that I know you may not want to hear, but they must be made nevertheless. The first is that this struggle in which we're now engaged, in a very real sense, is more deadly than war. Call it what you will, Cold War, revolution, struggle, whatever. The present stakes are higher than in any other war we've ever known. After all, why do we dread war? Well, there are three reasons: death, destruction, and human suffering. But ladies and gentlemen, if communism should ever come to America, we'll face more death, destruction, and human suffering than any people in history has ever faced at the hands of their invading conquerors. And it would make no difference whether the road to communism were traveled violently or non-violently.
So when they try to make the country and our system seem weak, realize that our division of power is so effective, it has staved off communist infiltration for over a century, better than any other country in human history. You might think we're losing this battle, mainly because a lot of these tactics appear new to you, but realize we've been in this fight since before you were born. And considering that much of our ignorance is due to systemic suppression of communist infiltration, we're still the historic leaders as the vanguard against communist infiltration.
Now, the second observation is related to the first. It is simply that we have now passed the point of painless solutions and parlor patriotism. There was a time, and not too long ago, I think, when we could have pulled ourselves out of this without too great a sacrifice on the part of anyone. All that would have been necessary would have been for us to take an interest in the domestic affairs of our nation and to insist that our elected representatives merely enforce the laws that were then on the books to protect us from internal subversion and to keep the enemy outside the gates. But we didn't. Instead, we slept.
60 years later, we have trans kids, and in some states, the possibility of your child being taken away from you if you don't allow them to start to transition to the opposite sex. I'd say it's gotten a little out of control, and we're past the point of no return, and you might have to draw some flesh to fix it.
Now the enemy is inside our gates. He is on our streets. He is in our halls of parliament. And now there is hell to pay. Our enemy is not going to leave quietly just because we suddenly discover him and ask him to go. Hardly. The nature of tyranny is such that, like the barb on an arrow, it goes in easily. But the price of pulling it out is a piece of flesh. Now let me be more specific. Before we finally win this battle, and I should hasten to say that there's no doubt in my mind that we're going to win. I'm increasingly convinced of this. But before we finally do see victory, it's now inevitable that some of us, even in this room, will lose our lives in the communist revolution that already is raging around us. I can't tell you who it's going to be, of course. But I can tell you that it'll make no practical difference whether we're resisting at the time or whether we're merely trying to hide. Most of the casualties will occur because people just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, I mention this not to suggest that we all grab our guns and groceries and head to the hills. In many ways, this too would be playing right into the hands of the communists. No, I mention it for only one reason, and that is to stress the seriousness of the challenge that now confronts this nation. It's literally a question of life and death for all of us. And it's about time the American people began to face up to that fact and to act accordingly. I have no idea of what each of you is going to do in the critical days that lie ahead. It may be much, it may be little. It may be nothing at all. I don't know. Only you can answer that question. But ladies and gentlemen, whatever it is you decide to do for your country, do it soon. Do it now. Every minute that you delay further will add dearly to the price of ultimate victory. Thank you.
So that was filmed in 1969. Later on that year, there was a news report that thankfully made us aware that a federal grand jury was aware of communists plotting to bomb federal buildings.
A federal grand jury in Detroit today charged the 13 top leaders of the Weathermen with plotting to bomb public buildings in Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Berkeley, California. The Weathermen are the militant faction of the Students for a Democratic Society. Only one of the 13 is now in custody.
Thank God the federal government had it on their radar that these radical, militant, epitome of Maoist students were planning to bomb buildings. 2 years later in 1971, they bombed the Capitol building. That's right, the place where January 6th happened. Let's hear how the author of a book encapsulating these events chronicles the history of how revolutionary communists bombed the Capitol building in 1971.
Your book is a timeline of the 3 months in the spring of 71, March, April, May, and it opens with one of those touch points that has resonance for our time. I'm going to turn to some archival video again. This is an ABC News report from March 1st, 1971.
The single bomb set off by a timing device left the men's room a shambles, plumbing demolished, bricks and plaster ripped from walls. Army and FBI experts sifted the debris, seeking a clue to the nature of the explosive. Damage estimated in the hundreds of thousands of dollars might have been far worse.
Could have been worse.
3-foot thick walls in the oldest part of the Capitol. As it was, the violent explosion ripped off doors in nearby conference rooms.
Lawrence Roberts, who bombed the Capitol? What was their aim, and how does it connect in with the May Day protests?
Within the New Left, there was a radical splinter group called the Weather Underground, which the members of the Weather Underground kind of declared themselves to be kind of urban guerrillas, revolutionaries, and they went into these underground collectives and began setting up bombs at...
They went underground. Started plotting how they were going to bomb buildings. Super casual.
Targets like courthouses, police stations,
communist,
college buildings that were, linked to the military.
So communist.
People who became so disillusioned
You
with
could say communist.
Democracy and capitalism, believing that
They were communist.
the only way to force change was to create some kind of revolutionary uprising by,
like communists.
by starting with these bombings. And the Capitol, they said was seen as sort of a symbol of U.S. domination within the movement, and particularly within May Day. This was a very controversial move because the purpose of May Day, who organized it believed, was to show that
You think that may have been controversial? To bomb the U.S. Capitol building?
That would help to, sort of move American policy.
When communists do it, it's called controversial, and you're not even allowed to call them communists. 4 years later in 1975, FBI.gov. In 1975, an explosion rocked the headquarters of the U.S. State Department in Washington, D.C., impacting 20 offices on 3 separate floors. A domestic terrorist group called the Weather Underground claimed responsibility for both bombs. The Weather Underground was a small, violent offshoot of Students for a Democratic Society, a group created in the turbulent 60s to promote social change. So based on that humanitarian effort, they have a more radical offshoot every time. And as per usual, the people, in this case students, advocating for democracy, Students for a Democratic Society, somehow had an infiltration of communists that were domestic terrorists. The people preaching democracy are oftentimes being fueled by radical communists, and they use that humanitarian effort to drive their agenda forward. When the Students for a Democratic Society collapsed in 1969, The Weather Underground stepped forward, inspired by communist ideologies. They're not communists. They're not communists. They were just inspired by communist ideologies. Thank you, FBI.gov, for educating me on the fact that they were just inspired by communist ideologies. They weren't communists. And embracing violence and crime as a way to protest the Vietnam War, racism, and other left-wing aims. By the next year, the group had claimed credit for 25 bombings, including the US Capitol, the Pentagon, the California Attorney General's office, and a New York police station. The key to disrupting the group, not the communists, the group, just a random group. The key to disrupting the group for good was the newly created FBI New York City Police Anti-Terrorist Task Force. Shouldn't we have known about these communists for decades? We needed a new task force to handle this random group that was inspired by communist ideologies that are bombing dozens of federal buildings. You have to laugh. I just showed you a video of a guy from 1969, 100% chronicling everything that's happening. He has that knowledge. Then a bombing happens and the FBI is like, we have to create a new task force to investigate this. The FBI, everybody. By the mid-1980s, the Weather Underground was essentially history. Still, several of these fugitives were able to successfully hide themselves for decades, emerging only in recent years to answer for their crimes. There it is. Got rid of the things we can't call communists. It ended in the 1980s. Though, and I'm sure it was an accident, the FBI skipped over the bombings of the US Capitol building again 6 years later in 1981.
May 19th was a women-led violent extremist group that sought to overthrow colonialism and imperialism, both at home and abroad.
Occasionally, they'll refer to this violent type of revolution as an anti-imperialist war or an anti-colonialist war, but they all equal the same thing. Wars of national liberation, anti-imperialist wars, and anti-colonialist wars are all phrases used to describe that aspect of communist revolution aimed at overthrowing the government by means of force and violence.
Formed by a group of well-educated middle-class women in the late 1970s.
In China, as in all countries, the communist appeal was aimed primarily at students, young, idealistic intellectuals, most of whom came from wealthy families who could afford to send them to school.
Many of them had been involved in extremist groups like the Weather Underground. They decided, even though it looked like the revolution wasn't around the corner, which some believed that it was still possible, and that they needed to devote their lives, really, to further their political aims.
In the early 1980s, there were communists that were so extreme they were dedicating their lives to bombing federal buildings because they saw the government as imperialists, so they seek to destroy them. Not so much overthrow the government, but more so destroy the government for their political aims. Do they teach that in the history books when it comes to American communism? As early as a few decades ago?
And they saw their obligation as
communists
being people who lived inside what they called the belly of the beast, to fight U.S. imperialism, to support third world liberation movements in places like Central America, the Middle East, West Africa. On October 20th, 1981, when they were involved in a botched, deadly robbery in upstate New York, the Brinks robbery, where 2 policemen were murdered and a security guard was murdered.
Bombing buildings and killing cops. Bombing the US Capitol building, that sacred place for Democrats in 2024 where January 6th occurred, yet was repeatedly bombed for a decade by communists emerging from the Students for a Democratic Society. Fortunately, there were arrests made.
Some of the members got caught along the way. In November 1984, one of the women, Susan Rosenberg, and one of the men, Timothy Blanc, were arrested outside a storage locker in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. What did the police find inside this storage locker? They found hundreds of pounds of TNT, high explosives, detonation cord, blasting caps, thousands of rounds of ammunition, automatic weapons, fully automatic Uzi rifles, shotguns, and pistols with the serial numbers filed off.
The woman that was arrested, Susan Rosenberg, was supposed to spend 53 years in prison. However, Bill Clinton commuted her sentence on his last day in office, in the early 90s. Years later, she started an organization that funded Black Lives Matter. Is it surprising that a Democrat commuted the prison sentence of a communist affiliated with some of the most violent acts of domestic terrorism on our government property that we've seen in a long time, just to then assist in the funding of Black Lives Matter, the most widespread race riots we've ever had, especially during a global pandemic where we had a lockdown and we weren't allowed to go to school or work?
Kimberly, I want to ask you about Black Lives Matter and its finances. And some of its fundraising is actually managed by an activist group, 1,000 Currents, which is sponsored by a charity set up by the Kellogg's founder of your breakfast cereal. It has a woman, Susan Rosenberg, sitting on its board of directors, on deputy head, once arrested for her ties to a radical left terrorist group responsible for killing police and bombing. Here she is.
I just never stopped wanting to make revolution, but I was in possession of explosives and weapons when I was arrested in 1984.
Now, Rosenberg was sentenced to 53 years prison, was pardoned after 13 by President Bill Clinton's last day in office, now helping Black Lives Matter. What does that tell you?
Well, I'd say it tells me a communist participated in some of the most vicious bombings of federal buildings, was deemed to be a domestic terrorist, and then had her 53-year prison sentence commuted after 13 years by the Democrat president, Bill Clinton. If someone sneezes and a Republican says, "Gesundheit," they'll say, "That's German, you're a Nazi." Imagine if Reagan commuted the sentence of a Nazi that was bombing federal buildings, a part of a syndicate of Nazis radicalized by the colleges that they went to bomb federal buildings on behalf of their political ideology. You're not allowed to see communism. And then she joined one of many non-governmental organizations, an NGO, or a nonprofit, or whatever it is, where you can just move money in between these organizations, and they were supporting Black Lives Matter, and it's just such a coincidence that the person involved in coordinating one of the most violent bombings on federal buildings in our nation's history was also funding one of the most violent communist revolutions, race riots, whatever you want to call them, especially during a pandemic lockdown where you were just allowed to protest and not go to school or work. That's what that tells me.
This Rosenberg, Marxist, convicted, terrorism offences. One of the three co-founders was on tape. We've played it on this show, saying they were trained Marxists themselves.
I think that the criticism is helpful. I also think that it might. I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories.
It's hardly like she's, you've got this pure movement over here and just this one person who's a bad look over there. I think it's a real problem. And I just wonder why so many people bend the knee to a movement led by such extremists.
Well, it sounds pretty obvious when you say it that way. It's almost like there's a concerted effort to hide communists to this very day. Probably the quickest way to sum up this entire video would be to say,
if you point out they're a communist, you're a racist.
In closing, what we are living under is the shadow of communism. It appears only in the presence of light and prosperity. It's a shadow that seeks to transition into a source of light, so it stalks the light. For those with light, hold the ultimate power. Never give your light to the shadow. Shine your light on the shadow. But when you shine a light on a shadow, it goes away. However, a different light creates the shadow. And when your light goes away, the shadow is still there in a different light. The light creates the shadow. Those that live in the shadows can only exist with those that have light. That is communism. The shadow that follows your light. The light they make is akin to a table lamp, desperately trying to emulate your light, which is the sun. And the sun needs no protection. It's just the truth. It just is. Sure, they'll try to convince you the sun can also be the moon, just to dim the sun's magnanimous shine, just to make the shadows harder to decipher in the moonlight. You might feel foolish if you've been deceived by this. You may have thought the sun could identify as the moon and therefore become the moon. But then you spent enough time in the sun to realize that's just communism.
Breaking news, stay at home. That is the order tonight from 4 state governors as the coronavirus pandemic spreads. New York, California, Illinois, and Connecticut all ordering non-essential employees to stay home. Those orders cover 75 million people across the United States.
What do you want? Justice! When do you want it? Now! What do you want? Justice! When do you want it? Now!
We see on the news that the death rate is rising. I'm looking in our computer system, I'm seeing the names, and I know who died of COVID and who did not, and I see a lot of COVID on the files.
You're seeing a second wave now.
We're seeing that second wave.
I'll give you a shot from Sky 4. You can see the front of this building is on fire. We also know in the same area that the Maxit Pawn Shop, which is a much bigger building, is on fire. An activist group live streaming the riot says they have taken over this building. We're not sure how taking over a building and the fire goes together, but you can see people are throwing wood and throwing things at the fire, making it continue to grow.